these are questions I've had about Joseph for, I'll say, since 2010. So it's been a while. And, I do the research and I hear different people say different things. So I'd like to hear from you because I do value your research. Let's talk about Joseph as Imhotep. Now, I know you told us, you said some names, what he's called in the Bible. I can't really pronounce it, but I do. Zaphanath. Say it.
Zaphnath Paneah, yes.
Zaphnath Paneah. Now, but then you mentioned another name where he's the son of Ptah. How do you say that?
Petaseth.
Petaseth. Now, what about the conversation with him as in Imhotep? And then I have some more information and more questions.
Yes, I've heard this identification, and I can see why people might actually say it, that he was Imhotep. But Imhotep goes back into Old Dynasty. He was one of the founding priests of Egypt, going back a long time. I'm not sure I believe that particular theory, that he was connected with Imhotep. I much prefer the work of Ahmed Osman. So many years ago, back in the 90s, Ahmed Osman wrote a book called Stranger in the Valley of the Kings. And he identified Joseph as being Yuya. And Yuya is the patriarch of the Amarna dynasty of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And he came out with a whole list of reasons why he should be Yuya. And I think he's probably correct, because Yuya would have been the prime minister of Egypt, exactly the same as Joseph was. Yuya was the most important man behind the scenes in the whole of Egypt. So he was never pharaoh, of course, but his progeny, I'm just trying to think how I think Nefertiti was his granddaughter or something. I'll have to look up the genealogy. So his genealogy is directly connected with all of the Amarna dynasty. He's intimately connected. A lot of the wives, I think the wife of Imhotep III, I think, came from Yuya as well. Again, I'd have to look that up in the genealogy. So he had all of these daughters that were going through the Amarna dynasty, all came from Yuya and Thuyu. And they were the most important people in Egypt at this time. And he made a very, very good argument that Joseph was actually Yuya, including the name matches as well, that Yuya and Yo might be connected as a name. And I think that's probably correct. It would certainly make sense. And of course, I don't know if I've got the image here, because I didn't know we were going to be talking about this. But if I quickly look this up, we've even got images of them, because they're sitting there in the Cairo Museum.
And when you say they, are you referring to Yuya or are you referring to who?
Yeah, to Yuya. So, here he is. Let's see if I can do a quick screen share. So if I screen share, and hopefully this will come up. So if I share that.
Oh, wow.
That is Yuya.
I've seen this before.
So we still have his mummy and Thuyu as well. They're both sitting in the Cairo Museum. They're the only two important people from the Valley of the Kings who are not actually in the separate museum. They're actually in the Cairo Museum. And you will notice he's ginger.
Yeah, that's what I've seen this before.
Because Yuya and Thuyu were both ginger, the same as Ramesses II was ginger. And so we have this strange thing of the ginger monarchy. And so it's likely that Nefertiti and Akhenaten were both ginger as well. And that, I think, is probably the biblical Joseph. And I'm just searching to see how I can stop. Ah, there we go. Stop sharing. There we go. Had to go there. So we're back. So that is Yuya. That is Joseph, as far as I know. And Ahmed Osman makes a very good case for this being the biblical Joseph. And I've not seen any really good arguments to say that it's not. So it's certainly well worth considering that we may have the mummy of Joseph sitting in the Cairo Museum. Now, of course, that's very contentious, and that's why you will not get that much research on this, because, of course, the Egyptians don't want that to be true.
Right.
They
Correct.
want to separate Egyptian history from Israelite history in the same way that the Israelites want to separate Israelite history from Egypt. Nobody wants this truth, this connection to be true, because it's so
Right.
politically inflammatory. You know, if my assertions are true on this part of Egyptian history and also the United Monarchy, it means that the original homeland of the modern Israelites is the Nile Delta.
Right. You know what? I do. That's one of my teachings, that the Bible, the Torah, is all Kemetic. Well, not all, but comes from Kemet. And
Yes.
there's so many esoteric gems in the Bible that you can find references to Set and Hathor. And so, yeah, I'm with you 100% that they don't want that connection, because it's a power struggle, like you say. I have some more questions
Sure.
about. So Imhotep is not Joseph. So,
Yeah.
but I have a question about the pyramid, Sakara. I thought that possibly Sakara could have been linked to Joseph. So, of course, we know Imhotep is linked to Sakara, but is there any connection at all to, and the reason is, let me tell you why. The story of the famine, which, by the way, those are esoteric. You can see the 7 cows, the 7 Hathors. Just want to throw that out there. And the Pleiades also, but the 7 Hathors are the 7 cows in the story of the famine, the dream of the Pharaoh. Now, I believe at Sakara there's a granary. And if you're familiar with that, I'd love to hear from you. I just thought, I was putting it together, like, possibly could that have been the hub or the place where they distributed, they meaning Kemet and Joseph, where the rations were given out. So talk to me about that.
Yes. Well, Sakara, there is a chronological dislocation here, because the Joseph we're talking about is 18th dynasty.
But you'll work that out, because you always say that the date.
Whereas Sakara is old kingdom, and it looks old kingdom as well. So there is a large span of time between Sakara and the Joseph story. I think his grain stores would have been up in the Nile Delta. It would have been at Tanis. Sorry, not Tanis. It would have been at Zagazig, or at modern Cairo. So Zagazig will be Pyramisi, but of course it wasn't called Pyramisi in those days. It was called Avaris. So the big capital city in the Nile Delta was called Avaris. And that was the capital city of the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. But when Akhenaten was thrown out of the country, according to Manetho, he went to Avaris as well. He went to the original old city of the Hyksos kings and rebuilt it as a fortress. So I think if there were any storehouses for grain, I think the ones he was most interested in would have been at Avaris or in modern Cairo, because those are the regions he controlled. He was if anything, he was the Hyksos were the kings of Lower Egypt, not so much of Upper Egypt. So that's where they would have kept them.
Is there any
Um,
archaeological, excuse me, like evidence that there could possibly have been grain stores distributed, like a hub for
well,
like
there
grainer?
are several very large grain stores because, of course, Egypt was the center of grain production. It was very productive in that era. It's the sort of place where you can grow 2 crops a year, sort of thing, and it was very fertile. So it was a very good grain producing area. So yeah, there's any number of grain stores across Egypt that could have stored that grain. But there's an interesting connection here with the New Testament Joseph as well, the father of the Jesus character, because he was also a prophet who prophesied a famine. So people have been saying, because you probably know that I said that the biblical Joseph, the New Testament Joseph, was a king of Edessa who would have been called Abgarus. And they were saying, well, why was he called Joseph? Well, because both of these people prophesied a famine. The Old Testament Joseph prophesied the famine, as we all know, but the king of Edessa and his queen, Queen Helena, they also prophesied a famine in Judea in the 1st century. And they both gave famine relief money. So Old Testament Joseph gave all of this grain out to the people of Egypt to save them from starvation. And the Edessan kings did exactly the same. They gave famine relief money to Judea in AD 48 or so in order to save Judea from famine. And so they are both doing the same thing. So when they changed their religion, when the Edessans changed their religion and became proselyte Jews, what better name to take than Joseph? Because they were both doing exactly the same thing. They were both forecasting a famine, and they were both alleviating that famine. And then, of course, the New Testament Joseph was known as a carpenter. But then so was the Old Testament Joseph, because the Old Testament Joseph was called Petaseph. Petaseph is the son of Ptah. And Ptah is the god of architects and carpenters. So they were both carpenters. And that name may have even come down to us, in my view, into the English. So Ptah is the god of architects, stonemasons. And when we go through into the Greek, of course, and the Latin, the name for a stone is Peter, Ptah. And so Saint Peter from the New Testament may be named after Ptah, not just simply a stone, because Peter means stone, but he's actually named after Ptah. So he's following the same naming convention that we find in the Old Testament. He was Petaseph, the son of Ptah, Peter. Because his name wasn't Peter, of course, his name was Simon. He was given this as a title that he would become the Peter. And so I think the name Peter actually is Egyptian. It's Ptah.
Patan, yeah, that makes sense. I
Mm.
have, we've had you here for a minute, but this is you're dropping a lot of gems, and so I'd like for you to talk to us about Joseph doing, as a historical character, doing the work of gathering the grain. There's questions that I've had and debates about the grain, and my stance is that he had, now this might sound completely ridiculous to you, but I'm going to throw it out there. I'm going to jump out the window. Fleet. of ships, and that he sailed to the New World and found corn and brought it back to, because it's indigenous to the Americas, brought it back to the old world. And yes, in the translations of the Bible, you see corn, 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 and they'll say, well, that's just because of the way it was translated. But there has been corn found in, you're gonna straighten all this out, in the tombs of the pharaohs. I think a pharaoh or maybe a couple. So talk to us about that information. Can you validate it, dispel it? Did he have a fleet, a navy? Did he go to the Americas and bring corn back? And was that part of the grain?
I
Should be
don't think there's any evidence for anyone going to the Americas at that time. And by corn, of course, they don't mention corn. The Old Testament mentions Dagan or Daga. And that is from an old Aramaic root, meaning to grow, to increase, to multiply. And so what they were actually producing is Daga, which we interpret as being corn, because corn increases and it produces fertility. So that was the common term that they were using. They also used the word bar, as in son of, from bara, which means what does it mean? It means to cleanse, to purify. But they use bar as meaning corn as well. I don't think there's much information from Egypt that they were actually using what we would call maize. We don't call it corn. So corn in Europe is wheat. So if I mention corn, I'm talking about wheat. If we're talking about sweet corn, we call it maize. We don't call it corn. And I don't think there's any evidence of that being in Egypt at this time. There is a little bit of evidence that it's actually depicted on the inside of Roslin Chapel up in Scotland, which is the famous Roslin Chapel from, the Dan Brown books and all of that sort of thing. And that's fairly controversial because that's, I think Roslin Chapel goes back to the early 16th century or something of that nature. Anyway, it was long before America was supposed to be discovered, and yet they've got images of maize on one of the arches, so indicating that someone had been there to the Americas before Columbus actually got there.
right.
I don't think there's any evidence of any transatlantic communication at that time. There are anomalies, of course. There was the anomaly of the mummy from Egypt that was stuffed full of tobacco, which was a bit odd because that's not supposed to be a European plant at that time. So that was an odd one. And I've not heard much more about that particular mummy. Going back even further into time, there's the oddity of the megaliths all being the same across the whole of the world. So there must have been communication during the megalithic era, but we might be talking 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, as we've discussed before for that. So that is a separate era. Could the Egyptians have gone across there? The solar boats at the bottom of the Great Pyramid could have been made into ocean-going ships. It was robust enough, it was big enough. All it needed was some additional gunwales along the side of it to keep the sea out. And yes, that solar boat could have gone across the Atlantic. I don't know if you remember, but Thor Heyerdahl crossed the Atlantic on a reed boat. So he didn't even go for the proper wooden boat that they had at the bottom of the Great Pyramid. He used one of the traditional reed boats of Egypt, which were just made from reeds and stitched together with, sort of like rope. and he sailed across the Atlantic on a reed boat, trying to prove that they could have gone to America in that early era. And he succeeded on the second attempt. This is going back into history. People probably don't know about this because I've not seen it in modern history. This is back in the 1960s and 70s. And Thor Heyerdahl, who was Swedish, I think, set out to prove that the Egyptians could have gone across the Atlantic. And so he had this reed ship built for him, and they were crossing the Atlantic. And forever and a day, crossing the Atlantic, they were tripping over this rope that came from the back of the ship and went down through the ship. And they put it there because it was on the original paintings in Egypt. They always show a rope going down through the hull of the boat. But they had tripped over this rope so many times, they thought they would get rid of it, which is a bit of a silly idea considering the Egyptians said it was, sort of necessary. So they cut this rope off and the back of the ship fell into the sea. And so it sank. So they had a second go about 5 years later, and they built a second boat. And this time they kept the rope on the back of the ship all of the journey. And they ended up in the somewhere near Florida, down in the Caribbean. And so they actually succeeded. They got across the Atlantic on a reed boat. So there's no reason why they couldn't have done with something like the Giza boat, which was a very sturdy wooden boat made of Lebanese cedar. No reason why that boat couldn't have gone across the Atlantic. The only thing we don't have very much evidence for contacts with the Americas at this time.
Right.
The only real evidence we do have is a report by Herodotus, which was also mentioned, I think it was in the Kebra Nagast as well. We had a report from about the 18th dynasty, I think it was. I think it was about the 18th dynasty. I'll have to read that, I think, of a ship that went around Africa. So they sent out, it's a bit like Hatshepsut had this big expedition.
I was about to ask you.
Yeah.
Didn't she have a navy?
Well, she must have done, because she certainly visited East Africa and she brought back all of these exotics from East Africa with, animals and dwarves and all sorts of strange things that came back from East Africa. But there's another report by Herodotus, which everyone says is complete mythology. And I think this was actually of the United Monarchy era. So I think it was actually 20th dynasty, of a ship that went around Africa. And everyone says this is mythology, but I don't think it's mythology, because the report is that as they went around Africa and came back to Egypt the other way round, as it were, the sun was always on the right-hand side. Now, again, we've got the same problem that we had with the Exodus story. How would any chronicler in that era know that the sun would always be on the right-hand side had they not actually done it? And of course, the report is perfectly true. As you sail through the Mediterranean, if you imagine you're going clockwise around, the sun, the midday sun, is on your right-hand side. And as you go around South Africa, round the bottom of Africa, the sun again is on your right-hand side. The midday sun is now in, as it were, in the wrong place. It's in the north, not in the south. And that is reported in these ancient reports. Now, how would the chronicler know that that happens had they not actually been around South Africa and come back via West Africa? That must be a true report. They must have gone around Africa. And this is quite early. I think if I remember correctly, it's probably about the 20th or 21st dynasties, but still quite early. So that's an interesting report of a very long voyage by the Egyptians. But I still don't see any real evidence for a contact with America,
Well,
although it's perfectly possible. They had the
what
technology.
about Joseph? When you showed the Yaya picture, uh, going to the biblical text, how he was carried, his remains were carried by the group of people, the Israelites. How do we work that out? That it says that he was buried at Shechem, and then we have this mummy. Can you kind of clear that up for us? And then thank you so much, Ralph
Mm,
Ellis.
my pleasure. Yes. Now, there are always, one or two difficulties when you're making this new theory. Um, I'm very pleased that, as I say, 95% of the facts do match. But there are one or two outliers, of course. And so that is one of the outliers. But do remember that Yuya was taken from his home and buried elsewhere. The only difference being that he wasn't taken on the Exodus and buried, because they took his bones out on the Exodus, didn't they? So the only difference is they didn't take his bones out on the Exodus and go up, because the Exodus out of Amana would have been up towards the Nile Delta. It would have been heading north. And the bones of Yuya and Thuyu were actually discovered in Thebes down in the south. So they were taken from his homeland to another place. But the only trouble being is that place is not necessarily the direction that Akhenaten and Nefertiti and all of the exiles from Amana would have been going in. They would have been heading north to safety, because they were fighting against the Thebans down in the south. That was their main enemies. And so, yes, Yuya was taken from his homeland, but he was actually taken south, and he was buried in the Valley of the Kings. That's why the book by Ahmed Osman is called Stranger in the Valley of the Kings, because Yuya was not a king. So how was he buried in the Valley of the Kings? That's how important this guy was. He was actually buried as a king, even though he was never pharaoh. That's why he is the stranger in the Valley of the Kings. So yes, that story could be correct, but he's just buried in the wrong direction. He went south instead of heading north. Whether you can say that's a real stumbling block to the theory, well, people can say that, but I don't think it is. The thing is, with the whole of my Old Testament theory and my New Testament theory, is that it is a series of pieces in a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, half of the jigsaw puzzle is missing because we're missing quite a lot of the history. So you're only working with half of the pieces to start with. But if this was a false history, if it was a bad theory, you would not be able to fit the pieces all together. But when I look at, the various stories in the Old Testament and New Testament, all of those pieces fit together very easily. And they make a cohesive picture as well. So it's not as if the picture doesn't look right. The picture they produce is a recognizable, valid picture of Egypt or of Judea for the New Testament story. It is a valid picture that makes sense, which the Old Testament never made any sense, and the New Testament is just as bad. That doesn't make a lot of sense either. There are so many holes in the story, it's untrue. But if you put it back into Egypt and you say that these people were not mere shepherds, they were shepherd kings, the whole story starts to make more sense. And so this huge, great jigsaw puzzle we've got starts to make a valid, recognizable picture. And it wouldn't do that if I was working with a poor theory that had no explanatory information in it. I mean, for instance, we've not spoken about Abraham, but we know that these people were more important than they are making out, because in the Old Testament, It says of Abraham that Abraham was a shepherd. Okay, so we've got a shepherd with, 200 starving sheep on the top of a hill somewhere. That's the picture of Abraham. But the Old Testament says that Abraham had 318 servants. Okay, so what shepherd with a few starving sheep has 318 servants? This is why I say that the original story makes no sense. It does not make sense. But it gets worse, much worse, because as we've said before, Josephus Flavius has his own version of the Old Testament, which is exactly the same, but it is more historical and more believable than the Old Testament. And Josephus Flavius says of this same event, he says that Abraham had 318 army officers. Now, wow, that's a problem, because if each of those army officers was a centurion, then Abraham had a standing army of 30,000 men. What type of shepherd? Yeah, what type of shepherd has an army of 30,000 men? Well, there was only one type of shepherd that had that in this era, and that was the shepherd kings, the Hyksos.
And he was very powerful. The story where he goes and defeats, he battles a king. It escapes me. I'm usually sharper, but the story where he meets Melchizedek. So yes, he was very powerful. Yes.
Yes, he was very powerful. So, the standard story cannot explain all of those little anomalies. And there are hundreds of these strange things that make no sense. And yet my theory of putting this back into Egypt as being the Hyksos and as being connected with Akhenaten makes sense of all of those problems within the Old Testament. And so if you have a theory which now not only makes sense, but now explains things that were inexplicable previously, I think we're on the right road to having a correct theory. And that's what gives me confidence that all of this is actually based on fact.
Was there ever a conflict between, or was there an alliance or a conflict between the Nubian dynasty, or the Nubians and the Hyksos, or were they an alliance?
No. Well, it depends which side you're talking about. Some people had alliances with them and some people were fighting them. If you read Manetho, the Hyksos were fighting against the Nubians, but then the Theban king fled to the Nubians for safety because he was basically being kicked out of the country by the Hyksos. And so he fled to the Nubians, and that's why Moses went down into Nubia, threatening the Nubians. So as normal with, political conflicts, there were various alliances, between people, and there were various conflicts between people. And so the Nubians were a part of this exchange, throughout history. They were either the friends or the enemies of the Egyptians at various points in time. Wow. As neighbors often are, in ancient times.
So I learned today that Moses was a type of general in a sense.
He was not just a general, he was the top army commander of all of Egypt.
Wow.
Yeah. According to Josephus, you see, now I don't know why people don't quote Josephus anymore. We have the believers who believe this story is true, but then they ignore half of the evidence. So they have the biblical story and they will read the Torah, but they won't read Josephus Flavius's parallel story, because he gives exactly the same story, but from a historical context.
Well, I've heard a lot of biblical critics of the people who are critics of the story. They put Josephus under fire. They say, oh, he embellished. Why is it that I have my idea, but why is it that I hear lately, so many different Bible critics saying, oh, Josephus isn't credible. Oh, we can't use any of his accounts, historical accounts.
Because the information he gives is controversial and they don't like it.
Like
like
you.
he says that they were the Hyksos.
Right.
He basically says they were the Hyksos on 2 clear occasions.
Hmm.
And we tried to put that into Wiki because that information is not, it's not even there in the reference books, even though that's clearly what he said. So we tried to put it into Wiki and it was deleted. And we went through about 3 months and 36 pages of the, I don't know if you are familiar with Wiki, but you get the talk page, which
Wikipedia.
tell
You're talking about Wikipedia?
Wikipedia, yeah.
Oh, you actually tried to add the information to
Oh
Wikipedia.
yes, I'm a big
Oh, wow.
contributor to Wikipedia, but I'm not a gatekeeper. So every page has a gatekeeper
Wow.
who looks after that page. And if you put something in that's controversial, they'll just delete it, even though it's valid information where you have references to it. And they will delete it. And of course, they said, well, what's the reference? Josephus Flavius. Oh, you can't use Josephus Flavius. He's unreliable, just as you were saying. And I get, hold on a minute. He was saying, because this argument went on for like 3-4 months, as I say. He was saying you cannot use Josephus Flavius as a reference in Wiki because he is unreliable. But if you go through Wiki, there must be 1 million quotes from Josephus Flavius about many pieces of history, because he is the only person who gives this history. If you're talking 1st century Judea, who do you go to for the information? You go to Josephus. If you go to the Old Testament, who is the main guardian of history of the Old Testament? It's Josephus Flavius. And so there's millions of quotes from him throughout Wiki. And yet we were not allowed to give this one 2-line sentence, 2-line quote from Josephus Flavius. And this went backwards and forwards in the talk page in Wikipedia, because you get the actual wiki page, but then there's a little bit called the talk page, which is all of the contributors arguing against each other and saying, well, this should be put into this page, and someone else is saying, no, it shouldn't because it's not valid, etc. Well, this went backwards and forwards, as I say, for months. And it was deleted from Wiki on about 12 or 15 occasions, because we kept putting it back in again and they kept kicking it off. And it finally ended up when the Wiki Guardians banned us both for, I think they called it page destruction or something, so that we were banned from Wiki for just trying to quote from Josephus Flavius, because they didn't want you to know that Josephus thought that the Israelites were the Hyksos. And that was the reason. It was political, it was religious. And so you cannot go to Wikipedia and get unbiased information, because they will not allow that information even on Wiki. And so the only place you can get that information is, I have to say, from my books, because other people won't allow it, and yet it's a valid point. Even if you don't agree with that point, you might say, oh, I don't believe Josephus in that point. He's talking about events that were 1300 years or 1500 years before his time, and therefore he didn't quite understand what was going on. You could make that argument, but can we have the information there, please?
Yes.
So that we can actually discuss it? This is why I hate all of this modern idea of canceling people, because they have different ideas. Well, perhaps those ideas might have some truth to them. Like the idea that, a certain virus might have come out of a certain laboratory somewhere in China that we're not allowed to mention. And that was banned information. You were not allowed to talk about it. I have been banned from sites because I mentioned it. Well, that information turned out to be true, just as the information from Josephus Flavius might turn out to be true. And so let's not ban this information just because you don't like it. But that's what they're doing. And you're right that there is a lot of pushback against Josephus Flavius.
Right.
Because what he says is controversial. Well, it's not controversial to me. It's only controversial to believers, because they've got this one fixed view of what happened in biblical history, and they don't want to stray away from that view because they're fixed in their belief systems. They have no capacity to think outside the box, and they are convinced that the Israelites were poor shepherds in Egypt, persecuted by those terrible Egyptians. You see how this persecution complex can propagate itself through the centuries and through the millennia. And yet that's probably not true. They were probably the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, the shepherd kings of Egypt, and they were probably very powerful people and very influential people. Remember that the mathematical papyrus, which is one of the basic texts that we've got from Egypt, it's in the British Museum. It's called the mathematical papyrus because it has many of the mathematical theorems that we still use today. But it's on this papyrus from 3,500 years ago. And it's a Hyksos document.
Wow.
So they were the guardians of mathematics and all sorts of things, all sorts of knowledge in that era. And yet we've forgotten their history. And yet I think they were very important and very influential people at that time.